Welcome back to Bible Basics for New Believers. We have walked our way through the Old Testament, and today we will be looking at a chart that will kind of put together everything we've talked about the Old Testament so far. So there's a link below for you to get that chart, and we will be using that pretty much exclusively today. So as we look at this chart, we first see that the history books are in red, the poetry books are in green, and the prophecy books are in blue. When we talked about history books before, we talked about them as narrative books, same word. Poetry books we also said were wisdom books, or also they were called the writings. So those words are interchangeable as far as we're concerned when we look at the Old Testament. So when we look at this chart, the thing we want to notice is this one line that starts on number 1 and it ends where it says Nehemiah on number 16. This is the historical line. This takes the storyline of the Bible. So if you would read these books right in that order, you're going to get the whole storyline of the Old Testament, starting with Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. In between 2 Kings and Ezra, we do see that there is this Babylonian exile, which we talked about, that 70-year period. There were no historical books written during that time, but if you follow the line down, you see that there were 2 prophetical books written, Ezekiel and Daniel. Of those 2 books, Ezekiel is predominantly all prophecy, but Daniel has both prophecy and history in it. So if you want to get a sense of that period from 2 Kings to Ezra, you would read the book of Daniel. So that kind of gives you an outline of how everything goes straight across. Up above and down below, we see where the other books of the Bible fit into this storyline. So we see that the prophetic books are pretty much along the bottom line, and when we see the other historical books and the poetic books are above on this scale. And it doesn't make any difference that they did it that way, but just the way that was put together on this Bible line. The story would follow pretty much this way. So we look at the book of Genesis, and on your chart you see below you have people and events, and above we see in Genesis Job. And we talked about this earlier, that the book of Job, which is basically talking about the subject of suffering and also of God's sovereignty, fits in the time of Abraham, about the 12th chapter of Genesis. So that's why you see it above that. Below Genesis, we see these names, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Abraham was pretty much very important man in the period of Genesis. And his sons, Isaac and Jacob, also, who are in the line of promise, are important. Jacob is especially important in the fact that the 12 tribes of Israel come from him. And Joseph is very important in that he is an image of Jesus in the Old Testament. He was the greatest son of Jacob. When we look below that, we see the events during the time of Genesis. That's the creation, and then the fall, when Adam and Eve sinned, and the world therefore fell under the curse of sin. Then we see underneath that the flood. Because sin had become so prevalent, God had to judge the world, destroyed everybody in the world who was living at that time except for Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. And then we come, after the flood is over, we see the word here, nations. That's at the Tower of Babel, where God confuses his language because people are building a monument to themselves. And God sees that the tendencies of sin is going to be even greater. So he confuses their language and makes them spread apart. And that's where the nations do develop. And last of all, we see the word covenant. And we want to make sure that we understand this covenant thing is very important in the Bible, because the Abrahamic covenant really is going to put in place the theme that's going to carry all the way from the Old Testament into the New Testament. The idea that God made a covenant with Abraham that promised him a great nation, which would be the nation of Israel, and that takes care of the Old Testament. But he also promised through that nation that he would bring a great blessing, and that great blessing is Jesus Christ. So that carries us all the way into the New Testament. So that Abraham covenant is very, very significant as we look through the Bible. Next, we come to the book of Exodus. As we've talked before, the timeline between Genesis and Exodus is about 300 years. When we look at Exodus, we see below the line, the people there are Moses. Moses is a very important part of the Bible in that he brings the law into existence by God. We see the words underneath there under events, slavery, because the people were enslaved in Egypt. Then we see the plagues. God frees his people by bringing 10 plagues upon the nation of Egypt. And the word underneath plagues is Passover. And Passover was that last plague in which God was going to kill the firstborn of every people, except for those who would put blood on the doorposts. That's how the Jews were kept from death, and Pharaoh lost his son. And at that point, he frees the people. We see underneath that freedom. That's the idea that now they are moving into freedom. Even though they leave after Pharaoh, he chases after them, and we see in Exodus that God clears the Red Sea for the people of Israel to pass through, and then closes it up as the Egyptians follow after them, destroying the whole army of Egypt. We look underneath there in law, and we mentioned this. Through Moses, the law is going to be given, which is going to govern the nation of Israel throughout the whole Old Testament. And at the end of Exodus, the instructions for building a place of worship called the tabernacle, which is basically a large tent, is given, and that is completed when we leave the book of Exodus. So when we leave Exodus, we next would come to Numbers, but we see in between Numbers on our chart is the book of Leviticus, that book that says number 3. And we have Leviticus here because they are still camped at Mount Sinai, and God, after he has seen the tabernacle built, through Leviticus is going to start the priesthood and develop the worship system for the Jewish people. As he does this, he also is going to make the statement of Leviticus that sets forth the relationship between God and his people, and that is that God is holy, therefore his people must be holy. So as we move on from Leviticus, we get into the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers, we see underneath there is no people mentioned, but Moses would still be in charge. But we see this events of doubt and wandering. The book of Numbers, we told you, is where God takes a census of the people before they were going to go into the promised land. They send out 12 spies, 10 come back with a bad report. 2, Joshua and Caleb, come back with a good report, but the people refuse to go into the promised land. God is angry with them and causes that generation to wander in the desert for 40 years until they are all dead and the next generation appears. And he takes a second census, and these are the people that will go into the promised land. Then we move over and we would see the book of Joshua, but between Numbers and Joshua above, we see number 5, Deuteronomy. And book of Deuteronomy occurs right at the eastern border of the promised land, right before they are to go into it. And in this book, its title would mean second law. Moses reiterates the law to the new generation so that they understand what they need to do to inhabit the land, the promised land. Moses dies in this book. He is, because of a sin, was not allowed to go into the promised land. and his second in command, Joshua, will be the man that will lead the people into the promised land. We move next into the book of Joshua, named after the general Joshua, who was second in command. And we read underneath there, and not only is he the person, but we have the promised land. So this is the conquering, and when we look at the book of Joshua, is the story of the conquering of the promised land. Probably the most significant story we are familiar with is the fall of the walls of Jericho by the people marching around. And we also need to make note that at the end of the book of Joshua, the statement is made that not all of the peoples that were supposed to be driven out of the land are driven out. And there is this small failure to drive out all of the evil peoples from the promised land. So we move over then into the book of Judges. So at the end of Joshua, Joshua dies. So we look at Judges, and the people mentioned underneath are Gideon, Samson, Ruth, and Samuel. And we see under events, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Under events also significant is at the beginning of the book of Judges, it says, a new generation rose up that did not know the Lord. The book of Judges is a book which is very concerning because the people act in a way that is so out of character for people of God. And we see 7 cycles in the book of Judges. And they begins with the people rebelling against God and failing to do what he has told them to do. God brings judgment by one of the peoples they failed to drive out of the promised land. The people then repent and cry out to God for deliverance. God then sends them a deliverer. That would be a judge. And most of these judges are local people. They are not one that covers the whole nation. And he delivers them from their trouble. The problem is the cycle begins over again. And this occurs 6 more times. So we have a total of 7 of these going on. We talked about Gideon. Most of us are familiar with the story of Gideon. Most of us are familiar with the story of Samson. These were both judges. And we see this book of Ruth. Right in the middle of the book of Judges is the book of Ruth. And Ruth occurs in about the chapter 10 of Judges. And Ruth stands in contrast to all of this bad things that is happening in Judges. And she is a Moabitess, a woman who is from a cursed tribe. She is past that curse, but she is also a Gentile and a woman. And yet, by her actions, she shows herself to be much more faithful than the people of God. And as a result, God blesses her, and she is actually in the line of Jesus. Ruth also introduces us the idea of the kinsman redeemer. And the kinsman redeemer is that the closest relative must redeem the relative. And so that brings us to Christ. This shows us that Christ had to be a man in order to redeem mankind. We then move over to the book of 1 Samuel. The 1 Samuel, we see the people, Samuel, Saul, and David, and the events monarchy. So the book of 1 Samuel, we looked and mentioned before that Samuel was a judge under our people, under judges, and he is a very significant judge. He is the judge that is going to move the people or the nation of Israel from being a judgeship unto a monarchy or a kingship. And he is very significant in that role. Samuel appoints Saul the first king. Saul does not turn out to be a good king, and eventually Samuel has to tell Saul that the kingdom is going to be taken away from him and given to David. And that pretty much is what the book of 1 Samuel is about. 2 Samuel then begins the story of David and his reign. And David is very significant in a number of ways. He is a man after God's own heart. No other man is ever given that significance. God makes a covenant with David that meshes with the Abrahamic covenant, and the fact that Abraham was told that he would bless the whole world. Well, David is told that there is a Messiah coming that will sit on his throne that will rule forever, and that ultimately will be Jesus Christ. So that takes us through the book of 2 Samuel. We see right above 2 Samuel the historic book 1 Chronicles. The book of Chronicles, 1 and 2 Chronicles, are actually written during the exile, but they cover the same material that are in 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings. So what 1 Chronicles does is reiterates the story of David, but it puts more of an emphasis on the promises and the good aspects of David's kingship. And above Chronicles, we see the number 19 in green, the poetry book, Psalms. And it's placed there because David is credited with about writing half of the Psalms, about 75 out of the 150, and he also compiled the rest. Then we move over and next into the book of 1 Kings. 1 Kings, then after David's death, we see his son Solomon rule. Solomon was a great king, and to speak in the sense of a secular kingdom, he brings the nation of Israel to its greatest glory in the sense of power in the world and its riches and all those sort of things. Solomon was a character that is a little disappointing. He starts out his reign with a love for God that is equal to his father David. But as he gets involved in running the kingdom and prospering the kingdom, he begins to take on these extra wives to make political alliances, and they sway him from his love of God. So much so that God says, I am going to punish the nation because of you, and it will be divided. So Solomon will be the reason that the kingdom will divide into two different entities. When we look at 1 Kings and 2 Kings, right above that is 2 Chronicles. And again, 2 Chronicles is written during the period of the exile, but it basically will look at not only Solomon's rule, but most of the rules of the kingdom of the south, the kings of the kingdom of the south. Above that, we see with Solomon, or in 1 Kings, the Song of Solomon, and we see Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. And those are all put in that point because Solomon writes each of these books. He writes a great deal of the Proverbs, and then he compiles the rest. In Ecclesiastes, he wrestles with the meaning of life. And in the Song of Solomon, he looks at what romantic love should look like. So at Solomon's death in 1 Kings, the nation is divided. And we have the northern kingdom, which consists of the 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom, which has only 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Rehoboam will rule over the southern kingdom, and Jeroboam will rule over the northern kingdom. The kingdom of the south will be the line of David, in which God will put his blessing. Rehoboam will turn the people of the north into idolatry, and that will be kind of the sense that will follow the whole kingship of the northern kingdom. There will be about 19 kings in the northern kingdom. Not one of them will be good. And the southern kingdom, there will be those 19 kings, but they will have a handful that are actually good kings. When we leave Solomon's death, right after that, we see underneath the 1 Kings the name Elijah. Elijah is a very significant prophet in the Old Testament, and he tries, especially towards the northern kingdom, to turn their hearts back to God. When we move on into 2 Kings, we see the names Hezekiah and Josiah, and we just continue this sense of the kingships of both the north progressing. But we see Hezekiah and Josiah written down there because they were two kings of the southern kingdom who brought great revival and kept God's judgment from coming upon the nation. But the north, there's a different story. Again, no good kings. And ultimately in 722 BC, in the middle of 2 Kings, the nation of the north is destroyed by Assyria. And from that point on, we only have the kingdom of Judah. During this time, we said there was a great prophetic mission going on. Elijah started it in 2 Kings. His successor, Elisha, will come in. Elijah does cover the early part of 2 Kings, but he is then taken to heaven and Elisha takes over. And he too tries to turn the northern kingdom back, but they refuse to listen. And therefore God ultimately is going to have to bring that judgment in 722 BC. But before doing that, as we look down into this blue section, you see to the left there it writes, Hosea and Amos, written to the northern kingdom, Israel, before the exile. God brings two writing prophets also to try to turn the hearts of the people back to himself. And then under that we read Isaiah, Joel, Micah, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah, written to the southern kingdom before the exile. So God is trying to turn the hearts of the southern kingdom as they too follow right after the northern kingdom, going away from God. They all do eventually fail, and in 586 BC, the southern tribes are taken into captivity into Babylon. We also see the books of Jonah and Nahum written to Assyria before the exile. Assyria is one of the main powers. Jonah goes and causes a revival to occur in Assyria before they destroy the northern kingdom. And right after that, Nahum, 100 years later, they fall back, Assyria falls back into its own ways, and God brings judgment upon that nation, telling them that eventually they will be conquered. And Babylon is the nation that does indeed conquer Assyria. We also read under there, Obadiah is written to Edom before the exile. And Obadiah talks to the people of Edom. Edom were the descendants of Esau, who was the brother of Jacob. And therefore they should have allied with the southern kingdom when it came under attack. But instead they helped the attackers, and God, being displeased with them, is going to bring judgment upon them. And he says so through the prophet Obadiah. Then we see the final notes. Jeremiah written before and during the exile, Lamentations written during the exile. So Jeremiah is significant prophet because he does actually prophesy during the pre-exilic period and during the exilic period. The way that happens is that the taking of the southern kingdom into captivity actually happens in three different waves. The first wave occurs in 605 BC, and where Nebuchadnezzar comes and captures the city of Jerusalem and then takes people back to Babylon. This is when Daniel, the prophet Daniel, is taken back. The second time occurs in 597 BC. This is the time when the prophet Ezekiel is taken into captivity. And the third time is what we talked about, which is the official date. The 586 is when the city is totally destroyed. And while Daniel and Ezekiel are in Babylon prophesying, Jeremiah is still left up till 586 BC prophesying in the city of Jerusalem. So that is why we see him as both a pre-exilic and an exilic prophet. And during this period, again, we mentioned we have only information from the prophet Ezekiel and the prophet Daniel. And both of them are telling the people that although God is bringing judgment upon them, rightfully so, that judgment will eventually end and he will restore the people. We go on to the book of Ezra, and Ezra is recording of the time of return of the people from exile back to Jerusalem. The 70 years period that God brought judgment upon them has ended. And in the book of Ezra, we see underneath that the people mentioned are Zerubbabel, Esther, and Ezra. And we see underneath that the rebuilding of Jerusalem as the events. So the people come back at 3 different times, just like the 3 different times that the city of Jerusalem was taken into captivity. The first return from exile is actually led by Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel comes back and he starts the process of rebuilding the temple. This is a hard process and it has a lot of delays in it. And the prophets Haggai and Zechariah that we see underneath there are those writing prophets encouraging the people not to settle back into the land and feel comfortable, and they need to rebuild the temple. Then God will show his blessing upon the people. Ezra returns at the second movement of the people back to Jerusalem. He is a priest and he begins the worship service. And he has to clean house in a number of different ways because of the people being unclean, and prepares them to go back into the sense of how to worship God. Above that, we see the book of Esther, book number 17 in our history books. And the book of Esther occurs between the first and second returns. The first return by Zerubbabel, the second by Ezra. In between that time, the book of Esther fits. That would be chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra. And at this point in time, the Persians have taken over from the Babylonians, and they now rule. And under the return, it's actually the Persians that are ruling the people, not the Babylonians. And there is a plot to wipe out the Jews. But Esther, who has become one of the queens of Persia, is used by God to prevent that from happening. And we finally come to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah leads the third return back to Jerusalem. He is responsible for rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. In those days, a city that was unwalled could not be protected and would eventually fall to attackers. So it was very important that this would occur. And Nehemiah is the one tasked with doing that. And the book of Nehemiah is totally about the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And the last book of the Bible, and not in the historical sense, but in the prophetic sense, is Malachi. And Malachi gives kind of a bad report. Even though all of this return has occurred and the people are back there, their heart for God is not where it needs to be. And Malachi begins to challenge the people. And ultimately, Malachi has to say, God is going to have to bring a Messiah. And God is going to have to bring the prophet Elijah, which will turn out to be John the Baptist, a prophet like Elijah, to bring the people back to him. And that's where the Old Testament ends. Thank you very much for listening to this video. I pray that this has been very helpful for you. This has been a summation of what we've talked about already. In our next videos, we will be moving into the New Testament and discussing it. And until then, God bless.